Well, welcome everyone, good morning. I know more folks will be joining us in the next few moments as we sort of get going here. So our speaker today is Dr. Christina Abreu. She's an associate professor at Northern Illinois University and director of the Center for Latino and Latin Studies at NIU. Her research focuses on the role of race, nationalism, and migration in Cuban and Spanish Caribbean diasporic communities of the United States, with a particular emphasis on popular culture. Her first book, Rhythms of Race, Cuban Musicians in the Making of Latino New York City and Miami, 1940 to 1960, examined the relationships between black and white Cuban musicians and the Cuban and broader Latinx communities of New York City and Miami in the 1940s and 50s. Her talk today will be on Cuba and the Revolution. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Abreu.
Thank you, everyone. Good morning. I want to thank Professor Fulton for inviting me to come and give a lecture to his class about a topic that I really enjoy teaching and talking about, which is Cuba and the Cuban Revolution. I have to apologize before I begin. I have really bad allergies today, so that's why I sound like I've got like tissue stuck up my nose. And I'm not contagious, so that's the other reason why I like to point it out. I'm not contagious, it's just allergies. But if I have to blow my nose in the middle, you'll have to excuse me. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the origins of the Cuban Revolution. What was it? How did it start? Who was involved in all of that? Part of the reason why I'm interested in Cuba and the Cuban Revolution is because my family is Cuban. I was born in the United States, but my parents both migrated to the United States from Cuba as a result of some of the consequences of the Cuban Revolution. And where I grew up, I was surrounded by Cubans. I grew up in New Jersey, in Hudson County, which is the county that has the second largest number of Cubans in the United States. Anybody know where what part of the United States has the most Cubans? Miami, yeah. Yeah, Mr. Pitbull, any Pitbull fans? Mr. 305, right? So Miami, all right, has the most Cubans. Where I grew up in New Jersey has the second most Cubans. And so as I was going to college and as I was going to graduate school, I got more and more interested in sort of my family's background and wanting to kind of better understand why all these Cubans were now in the United States. And all of that kind of pushed me to think about and want to know more about excuse me, the Cuban Revolution. So, okay, before we get to this, let me not get there yet. Do you guys know anything about Cuba? Do you know any famous Cubans? Daisy Fuentes, that's like a throwback from MTV. Anybody else? No famous Cubans? Fidel Castro, okay. That's a good one. Anybody know his brother? Raul, okay. When someone mentions, or if you come across, something related to Cuba, is there anything you think about? Cuban Missile Crisis. Bay of Pigs. Cigars. Right? What pairs nicely with cigars? Rum, right? Coffee, right? All those sorts, palm trees, beaches, right? Beautiful women, right? All that sort of stuff. So, what's that? The Godfather movie, Scarface. Anybody seen Scarface? Right? Talking about Cubans in the 1980s. So, oftentimes, when we think about Cuba, we think about the Cuban Revolution, and when we think about the Cuban Revolution, oftentimes we think about the great men, right? The leaders of these movements, right? And the revolution was radical, right? It was a major turning point in Cuban history, big change, right? And so oftentimes we think about Fidel Castro, does this have a pointer, Josh? No? Okay, so I'll manually point. Fidel Castro, right? And this is Raul Castro, his brother, who just recently stepped down from being president of Cuba. Anybody know who this guy is? Che Guevara, right? So these are kind of the leaders, right, of the Cuban Revolution that we often associate with bringing about, right, the big change in Cuban history and Cuban society. And it's true. They were very important and they played a big role, right, in leading to the revolution. But what I want to point out as well is that in addition to their leadership and their ideologies and their beliefs, right, there were other factors. There were other reasons why the Cuban people supported the Cuban Revolution. And some of those factors, some of those reasons are not necessarily political, right? I would argue that they're more so social and cultural, right? Because when we think about Cuba, we think about in the 1950s, Cuba was where Americans went on vacation. It's where middle class, upper class, white Americans went to have fun, to go be bad. It's where they went to drink, right? It's where they went to gamble. It's where they went to see women, right? It's where they went to drink rum, smoke cigars, right? And so these images, I think, are representative of some of the other factors why the Cuban people eventually wanted to challenge those sorts of representations or those sorts of stereotypes and supported the ideologies of Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, and Che Guevara. Okay? And so we'll talk about some of these things at length as we sort of go through the presentation. Before I kind of get into the specific examples, I like to frame all of my lectures with a thesis statement. It's a way for you to keep me honest and on track, right? Because this lecture has an argument, right? And so this is what I'm going to be arguing, and I'm going to provide you with evidence and examples that I hope supports this thesis statement, right? So you have to pay attention, because you have to call me out if you are like, oh no, I don't think that supports what you were saying in the beginning, or I don't know, that doesn't kind of make sense, right? So what I'm going to be arguing is that Cuba hovered between the possibility of reform and the reality of revolution throughout the first half of the 20th century. So what does that mean? Between 1900 and the 1950s, right, Cuba, emerging out of, right, the colonial period, was a nation in development, right? There were changes, there were reforms, right? But something kept getting in the way of realizing the ideals on which the Cuban nation was founded, right? So what were those things that kind of got in the way? Well, I'm going to argue that it was corrupt political leadership, widespread poverty and unemployment, tourism, U.S. intervention on the island, that all of those things contributed to crises that ended the Cuban Republic and led to the triumph of the Cuban Revolution of 1959. Okay? So when someone asks you, why was there the Cuban Revolution? What started the Cuban Revolution? What was that all about? Right? There's no single answer. Right? It's a coming together of a variety of different factors that led to the revolution of 1959. Okay? Any questions about that before we kind of get through some of the specifics? No? Okay. All right. So let's see. I spoke with Professor Fulton, and he said that you guys did talk a little bit about Cuba previously. Was he lying or is he right? He's right? Okay. I don't know. Shaky ground. All right, so Cuba. Cuba was a colony of what empire before its independence? I hear Spain. Is that right? Yes, right. So Cuba was a colony of Spain before its independence. In fact, Cuba was the last large territory in Latin America to achieve its independence in 1898. Okay? What happens is, and I'll kind of go through this quickly, but what happens is Cuba emerges from its independence from Spain not fully independent. And it emerges not fully independent because of US intervention, right? Cuba, right, had fomented an independence movement led by José Martí, right, who articulated this belief, right? The reason why the Cuban independence movement was succeeding was because José Martí and other Cuban leaders like Antonio Maceo, right, they articulated this belief in a Cuban nation that was a Cuban nation of white Cubans, a Cuban nation of black Cubans. It was a Cuba for all Cubans, right? So they got everybody on board, right? They're fighting Spain, they're defeating Spain, right? The United States, however, always had its eyes on Cuba for a variety of different reasons, right? Interested in sugar, interested in its strategic position in the Caribbean, right? And the US gets involved, right? And so the US gets involved, Spain is defeated, and the US never really leaves, right? The United States then, in order to leave Cuba alone a little bit, right, they enact a series of policies that make it so that Cuba, throughout the first half of the 20th century, can't really do anything, can't really assert its sovereignty without the approval of the United States, right? And that was because of something called the Platt Amendment. Have you heard of the Platt Amendment? No? Okay. So the Platt Amendment was an amendment to the treaty that ended the War of 1898, right? That gave Cuba, anybody know the U.S. military base in Cuba? Guantanamo Bay, right? The United States has possession of Guantanamo Bay because of the Platt Amendment in 1898, right? Because of the Platt Amendment of 1898, Cuba's trade policies, its interactions with other nations across the globe are all dictated by U.S. priorities, not by Cuban priorities, right? And that limits Cuba's independence. And there are many Cubans on the island who are frustrated by that limitation of their freedom, of their independence, of their nation, right? And so because of that, throughout the 20th century, there's always this thinking back to the independence that could have been had the U.S. not intervened, right, in the independence movement of 1898, right? And the reason I start the lecture, right, with this is because it's the historical framing or the historical context, right, that helps us understand what happens in the 1950s, right? Because Cubans don't forget this, right? They don't forget the U.S. Getting involved in their independence movement. All right, questions about any of that? No? Okay. So I mentioned that one of the other factors leading up to the revolution was corrupt leadership. Okay? So Cuba has a series of leaders or presidents in the 1950s that really end up disappointing the Cuban people, but they do it in a way that's like super devastating, because each of these leaders that we're going to talk about comes to power, sometimes through a free, legitimate election, sometimes through a military coup. But in either case, they start out promising the Cuban people the things that they want: sovereignty, better economic opportunities, better infrastructure, better jobs. And then eventually, they don't deliver on those promises. And it's not just that they don't deliver on those promises, but they go back and they turn their backs on the Cuban people and do things that the Cuban people are like, wait a minute, that's not positive for Cuba. That's actually positive for the United States, right? And so there's this back and forth, this tension, right, that arises from that. So I'll start with Gerardo Machado. He was president of Cuba late 1920s up until 1933. Some fun facts, if you're ever on Jeopardy, about Gerardo Machado. He only, wait, let me make sure I want to give you the right. On his left hand, he only had 3 fingers. He had worked when he was younger in a butcher shop. And through a series of accidents, lost 2 fingers. He was also, another fun fact about Machado, he was married to his cousin. So, another fun fact about him. Machado was a businessman. He had involvements with Cuba's sugar mills. Sugar was Cuba's principal crop, its principal way of making money. The island had been, Cuba was a monoculture, right? Meaning that that was its lone way of making money as a nation, right? Previously, the sugar mill, the sugar industry benefited or was run through slave labor. With the abolition of slavery and industrialization, sugar mills become much more dependent. They still become, they remain dependent on principally the labor of Cubans of color, but they become mechanized also in certain ways. That also creates problems for the economy because there's widespread underemployment because of that. So Machado is president. During his presidency, at first, he offers reforms. But what happens is that in the 1920s, sugar prices fall, and the economy takes a dip. And so there's widespread unemployment and underemployment. Okay? And so student groups and other groups throughout the island, they start to protest the fact that they don't have jobs, the fact that they don't have money to pay their utilities, the fact that there's food scarcity. And so Machado does not like that there are all these protests, that there's all this discontent on the island. And so his response is to basically try to stop the protests. He develops a secret police called the Porra, and they go throughout the island to and very violently try to put down all of the strikes and protests and challenges from the Cuban people. Now, throughout his presidency, the United States supported him because he was doing things on the island that protected U.S. companies. You know, those sugar plantations that I mentioned were owned not by Cubans, but by American companies, American corporations. So long as Machado was protecting the U.S. companies and the U.S. corporations, the U.S. supported him and continued to recognize him as the president of Cuba. But what happens is protests increase, Machado's violence towards the Cuban people intensifies, and the United States starts to worry about what they called the, quote, the Cuban situation, right? They're like, things are uneasy, things are uncertain. What's going to happen? Is there going to be a revolution, right? So because of that, the third guy over here, Fulgencio Batista, he's a sergeant in the Cuban army. He partners with a guy named Sumner Wells, who was, basically he was a diplomat sent by US President Franklin Roosevelt to kind of scope out the situation, see what's going on in Cuba. And so the two of them, Batista and the US diplomat, orchestrate a coup, a sort of a takeover of the Cuban government. Okay, so in 1933, Machado is pushed out of the Cuban presidency. In response, it was a coup that it's what's called a bloodless coup, meaning there wasn't any violence, there wasn't any armed conflict in removing Machado. Now, of course, the United States doesn't want to seem as though they're involved. So what happens is Batista puts together a junta, a sort of rather than picking one president, they pick a group of presidents, right? Does anybody watch The Office? Nobody watches The Office? Well, a few people. Caleb watches The Office. You guys got to watch The Office. That's your homework. Go home and watch The Office. There's a joke on that show that, you know, how many captains should there be of a ship? One, right? You know, like if you've heard of the saying, how many cooks in the, right? Too many cooks in the kitchen, right? So it's a very interesting concept that they come up with. Okay, we're going to come up with the presidency of Cuba by a 5-man junta, a 5-man group. That doesn't work out so well because what do you think they do? Yeah, they all fight against each other. They all have different agendas. They all want to be the top dog. They all want to be in charge. So it doesn't go so well. Eventually, this guy in the middle, who was a doctor, Ramon Grau San Martin, he emerges as the president of Cuba in 1934. He was very popular with the Cuban people because he was very outspoken in his opposition to the United States, right? He won the support of Cuban young people, Cuban students, of Cuban workers, right? Of labor. He even had the support of the Cuban military, right? A very strange, uncommon union, right? Where you had students, labor, and military all liking the same person because of the promises that they were making, which was to be free of the influence of the United States. Guess who doesn't like that? Yeah, the United States, right? The United States is not his fan. So the United States decides that okay, you're gonna talk all that smack. Guess what? We're not gonna recognize you as the rightful leader of Cuba, right? And if you followed a little bit of what's been going on in Venezuela and whatnot, recognition by the United States of you as the rightful leader seems to be pretty important, right? Seems to be pretty key to legitimizing your rule. So because Grau San Martin and his policies don't get him that support, he's immediately out. His presidency lasted 100 days. He's ousted from the presidency in a scenario where Batista is kind of behind the scenes orchestrating what's happening. And so a series of presidents replace Grau San Martin, who are essentially very powerless. They're just kind of the face of the presidency, where Batista is kind of behind the scenes calling the shots. Okay? Fast forward to 1940, Batista is elected legitimately to the Cuban presidency. Okay? The Cuban Constitution, however, did not allow him to run for president a second time. Right? So in 1944, he steps down from the presidency. There's a new president of Cuba, but he remains involved in Cuban affairs. He becomes a senator out of Las Villas, and he's still in the picture. There are some changes made, surprise, surprise, to the Constitution. And in 1952, Batista is elected to the presidency again. He's actually pretty popular when he's elected to the presidency in 1952. Batista has kind of an interesting story. He was from a poor family in the countryside. He was not very well educated. He was of mixed race. He rose through the ranks of the Cuban military. But by 1952, he becomes power hungry in a lot of ways. He becomes very interested in wanting to increase Cuba's wealth, which would then increase his own wealth. Right? So he becomes very supportive of the expansion of U.S. influence on the island. So he enacts a bunch of policies that make it so that he allows more gambling on the island, construction of more U.S.-owned hotels on the island. All of these policies that are favorable to U.S. corporations, right? To the U.S. government, while simultaneously, in many ways, neglecting, right, the development of Cuba's own infrastructure, roads, education, healthcare on the island, right? Kind of not really being interested in the things that would improve the quality of life of Cubans, of the Cuban people. So what happens is, in the 1950s, you have all of these different groups who start to protest in different ways what life had become on the island. So you have students, particularly students from the University of Havana, who are in the city, who are actively protesting, going on strike, setting off bombs, right, on the island to disrupt Cuba's business, right, to make it so that tourists wouldn't feel safe, right, to make it so that there would be disruption to the utility companies that were charging really high prices for electricity and things like that on the island. You also have, there was also a growing divide in Cuba in the 1950s between Cubans who lived in Havana in the city and Cubans who lived in rural areas. Okay? Major contrast in the way of life. So in the countryside, there were no roads, there were very few schools, very few hospitals, very few opportunities for the Cuban people living in the countryside. For women, right, very few opportunities. One of the things that really upset Cubans, both in the countryside and in the cities, was prostitution, right? So Cuban women who were becoming involved in prostitution, connected to tourism, right, and you know, the nightlife on the island. And so in the 1950s, there was all sorts of growing discontent. And particularly in the rural areas, you have peasants, right, who are underemployed, who can't feed their families by working in the sugar mills, right, who are also taking up arms against Batista in hopes of bringing change to the island. Okay? So before I sort of get into some of the other factors, I just want to point out that we've been talking about the Cuban Revolution, right? Oftentimes when we think about revolutions, right, we also think about like war, right, and battle, right, and the battle of this and the battle of that. Cuban Revolution was not like that. Cuban Revolution was in many ways a political rather than a military victory. There was really only one major, if you could call it that, battle during the revolution. That was in Santa Clara in December 29th of 1958. The revolution really was, right, strategic attacks, kidnappings, bombings, various forms of sabotage in the city, right, principally in Havana, and then guerrilla sort of fighting in the mountains of the eastern part of Cuba. The mountain range was called the Sierra Maestra, which was in Oriente, right, the eastern part of the island. Nonetheless, during after the triumph of the revolution, right, Fidel Castro and other revolutionaries got really into celebrating, right, and memorializing the revolution, and so they clung to the Battle of Santa Clara. And so if you go to Santa Clara today, you'll see this memorial to this event, which was the bombing of a train that was carrying military supplies to Batista's soldiers in the eastern part of the island. Okay. Where are we at? Okay. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the economic factors that led to the revolution. I've mentioned that U.S. corporations owned or controlled Cuba. I just want to give you some figures so that you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. U.S. companies owned 90% of Cuba's mines. They owned 80% of its public utilities, 50% of its railways, 40% of its sugar production, and 25% of its bank deposits. Okay? You don't need to know those specific percentages, but the big takeaway from that is that the U.S. owned a lot of Cuba. Okay? And Cubans themselves owned very little. Okay? There's widespread poverty and unemployment. I really like this image up here. What's the sign? I don't know if you can see it from where you're sitting, but the sign in the background. Can you see what it says? Casino, right? And then what do you see here? Yeah, it's like shacks, right? Like poverty, right? You see to a woman, some children, right, living in impoverished conditions. And in the background, right, you see a sign for a casino. Anybody been into a casino? Or seen a casino in movies? What are they like? Opulent, right? They're fancy. You walk in there and there's lights and there's bright colors, right? Depending on what casino you go into, people might be dressed up, right? There's wealth. You go there with money to spend money, right? To try to win money, right? And that stands in contrast, right, to the poverty that we see, right, in the front part of the image. It's that contrast of prosperity, right, or the opportunity to prosper versus, right, the despair, right, and the lack of opportunity to prosper. And that was rampant throughout Cuba. There's also the divisions, right, between, as I mentioned, between city and countryside, between white Cubans and black Cubans, right? In Cuba, even though, right, Jose Marti and Antonio Maceo had founded the Cuban nation, had fought for Cuban independence, for white Cubans, for black Cubans, for all Cubans, right? They founded the Cuban nation on this idea that in Cuba, there was no such thing as a white Cuban. There was no such thing as a black Cuban. There are only Cubans, right? That sort of colorblind ideology totally goes away, right, throughout the first half of the 20th century. And what you see is sort of a return to a segregated way of life, right, where white Cubans, right, had more opportunity, more opportunities for wealth, than did black Cubans who predominantly lived in the countryside, right, tied to lands that had previously been sugar plantations under slavery, right, and had fewer opportunities for economic growth, okay? So those are some of the factors that are kind of leading to, the economic factors that are leading to the revolution. Then, right, we get to Fidel Castro. You could do a whole lecture on Fidel Castro by himself because his life story is so interesting, and sort of the way that he was mythologized, right? Even, right, in the 1950s, right? The New York Times very famously, right, sends a reporter who sneaks into the mountains to interview Fidel Castro in the early 1950s. That kind of begins, right, the myth of who he was. Fidel Castro started he comes into the picture in the late 1940s, 1950s. He's a student at the University of Havana who starts to get involved in the student protests, the student strikes, the student movement against Batista, okay? What happens is, well, first let me tell you the story first. So what happens is, Castro and other students, they decide that they're going to, they plan an attack against the Cuban military. It's called the attack on the Moncada barracks. So there were these military barracks that they were going to attack, and their plan was, it was on July 26th, okay, 1953. Very important date, July 26th, because Castro later will name his revolutionary movement the July 26th movement, okay? So July 26th, they plan an attack on the Moncada barracks where Batista's soldiers were sleeping, and they planned it for July 26th because that's when there's carnival in Cuba, right? So it's sort of a celebratory sort of party carnival season. So they figure, right, what happens after a night of celebrations and partying? Yeah, you go to sleep, right, and you're hungover, you're caught off guard, right? So they plan the attacks. They're like, we're going to catch them off guard. We're going to take over the base, right? We're going to take over the barracks. We're going to seize their arms, and the revolution will have begun. It doesn't go that way, right? The soldiers are not particularly caught off guard. They're outnumbered. They're outgunned, and so Castro and a bunch of his buddies who were involved, they're all arrested, okay? There's a trial, and Castro in particular is sentenced to 15 years in prison, okay? Now this is important. Castro, up until this point, was just another student leader, right? He hadn't yet become the face of the revolution, okay? But at his sentencing, okay, at his trial, for some reason, he's allowed to give a 4-hour-long speech. you guys ever watch like action movies where the bad guy or the good guy is pointing a weapon at someone, and instead of just shooting them, they stand there and talk at them, right? Do you ever ask yourself, like, why haven't they shot them yet? Like, what is happening here? Like, why are they having all this dialogue, right? This is the same thing. I don't understand. They let him talk for 4 hours, and he gives this impassioned, powerful, engaging, charismatic speech where he just outlines clearly, with evidence, all the things wrong with Cuba because of the United States, because of the corrupt past political leaders. He then outlines his vision for what Cuba could be, very clearly, very passionately, very, just full of emotion, right? And then very famously at the end, he says, "Condemn me. It does not matter. History will absolve me." And then he drops the mic and walks out. And as he's walking out, he turns to someone in the crowd and he says, "Did you write that down?" Right? And so someone had, of course. And then that testimony that he gives, right, gets circulated throughout Cuba and kind of becomes this motivator, it becomes the document that kind of leads to Cubans identifying Fidel Castro as the revolution, as the leader of the revolution. Right? But it's important to point out, right, that before he enters the picture, there were Cubans already challenging Batista and already working up to the revolution. Okay? So Fidel Castro, he is sentenced to 15 years in prison, but that's in 1953. But Batista is encouraged by his advisors, by the Catholic Church, to pardon Castro and other activists who had been involved in the Cuban Revolution, and Batista does. So Fidel, his brother Guevara, right, all of the principal leaders of the revolution, right, they get released from prison. Okay, they don't stay in Cuba so they're released from prison in 1956. They don't stay in Cuba very long. They go to Mexico. In Mexico, they plan another attack. Right? So they go to Mexico, they reconvene, they re-energize, right? They connect to networks back on the island who are working towards revolution. And then they get a boat. The boat's named the Granma. They hop on this boat. They set sail for Cuba. The eastern part of the island, where the mountainside is, right, where they could sort of foment the revolution, right, undercover, protected by the harshness of the mountainside. And then it's in 1956, 1957 that you see intensified conflict between Batista's army and Castro's forces on the eastern part of the island, and then the student activists, of which there were many women involved in the student strikes and protests in the city. And so in many ways, it's because of Fidel Castro, who unifies these two groups, right? Who unifies the activists in the city, who unifies the peasants in the countryside, that the Cuban Revolution is in many ways what you could call a cross-class collaboration, right? It's the middle class, middle upper class Cubans in the cities, the poor Cubans in the countryside. They come together, unified by Castro and his 26 de Julio, 26th of July movement to fight against Batista. So I'll kind of fast forward. We'll skip this one, but let me fast forward. Well, let me go back here. So I'll just fast forward real quick. So what happens is there are, so there's fighting in the mountainsides. There's protests in the cities. Eventually, what happens is that Batista's military, the soldiers under his command, become very demoralized. And essentially, they decide that they're just not into it anymore. They don't want to fight on behalf of Batista anymore. Simultaneously, right around the same time, the U.S. government decides that it's no longer going to support Batista. It's no longer going to supply Batista's army with weapons with which to keep fighting Castro's forces. And so in 1959, well, actually, it's December 31st, 1958, right? New Year's Eve. Batista and many of his closest, right, supporters, they flee Cuba. They board planes, right, filled with money, right, and stuff. And they leave the island Batista goes first to the Dominican Republic, and then eventually makes his way to the United States. And so it's on January 1st, 1959, that Castro declares victory, right? That the revolution has succeeded, right? Castro and his forces were on the eastern part of the island, and what they begin doing on January 1st is literally marching from the eastern part of the island to the western part of the island till they get to Havana, right, where they're greeted by an immense, right, huge celebration. People had already been celebrating, right, in Havana, and one of the first things that Cubans do when they learn that Batista has fled the island and that the revolution has succeeded is, anybody know? Or can you think? One of the first things they do is trash the casinos. They go into the casinos, they take out the slot machines, they just trash them everywhere, right? And I think that that's important because I think it demonstrates, right, the Cuban people's frustration, not only against their own corrupt leaders, but also against, right, Cuba's over-reliance on the United States. Okay? Questions about any of that? All right, we'll end there. Thank you all for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for helping us to sort of reframe the optics of the revolution. It was a wonderful, wonderful talk. If somebody is interested in classes at NIU or perhaps the Center for Latino and Latin Studies at NIU, and they maybe want to learn more, is there a good place that they can do that?
There's definitely a good place. I teach a course on modern Cuba, usually every spring. I teach a course on Cuba. My colleague Ann Hanley teaches a course on modern Latin America. And then we have another course on Intro to Latin American Studies that all kind of focus to some degree or another on Cuba. And we try to bring in guest speakers every semester. Usually we bring in someone who does stuff on the Caribbean and then someone who does stuff on like US Latinos. So lots of Cuba stuff going on at NIU.
Wonderful. Any questions?
But when did the exodus of Cubans begin?
So almost immediately. So right, Batista is really like the first. His departure starts the first wave of Cuban exiles. So the first wave, the first mass exodus begins 1959 up until about 1961. And in that first wave, it's when you have the very wealthy Cubans who leave. Overwhelmingly, at the beginning of the revolution, the overwhelming majority of Cubans were supportive of the revolution. But very quickly, people then start to wonder about Castro's vision for the island, right? Castro had promised elections. Those elections never come to be, right? They start to see Castro say a lot of negative things about the United States and not so negative things about the Soviet Union. And that worries, right, the very wealthy Cubans on the island who worry about, you know, what's going to start happening. Because one of the things that Castro does is all those utility companies, all that land that had been owned by U.S. corporations, he takes back. He nationalizes those utility companies. He nationalizes those corporations that owned U.S. land and that owned Cuban land and whatnot. And then the elite wealthy Cubans start to worry, well, is he going to come for my stuff next? Right? And he does, right? And but before that happens, right, they want to get away, right? They want to leave the island. Because what starts happening is people, as Castro becomes more and more vocal about his rejection of capitalism in favor of socialism, no one believes that the United States is going to let that fly 90 miles from the United States, right? Everyone is like, of course the United States is going to orchestrate some kind of coup, some kind of takeover, some kind of thing, right? And the U.S. tries, right? But they don't do it. They don't do a good job at it, right? And so people who left, right, early on, they thought they were going to get to come back right away. They thought that their leaving the island was going to be very temporary, right? There's a very famous saying among Cuban Americans, and that Cubans, because they had to celebrate, right? You know, they leave the island, they have to celebrate their first Christmas, their first New Year in the United States. And so like that first year, they started this tradition of saying, el próximo año en Cuba, next year in Cuba, right? Because they thought, this is just this year, next year it's going to be in Cuba. And the next year never comes, right? For a lot of the Cuban Americans, right, who continued their opposition, right, to Cuba's shift to the left. So that's a long-winded way of answering that question. But it starts in 1959, 1961. Then there's another wave, 1965 to 1971 more or less. There's the wave in 1980 of the Marielitos. There's a wave in 1994 of the Barceros. And then, you know, beginning with like the thawing of U.S.-Cuban relations under Obama, you saw another spike. And that's not to say that there wasn't migration of Cubans to the United States in between those periods, but those were when you had like these mass moments of Cubans coming to the United States. Thank you guys. Thanks for your attention. Appreciate it.